The night was cold over Manhattan, December air sharp as glass. Yellow light pooled beneath the Dakota archway, trembling on wet stone. A limousine pulled to the curb. John Lennon stepped out, humming a melody about peace. A man in shadow whispered his name, raised a gun, and shattered the melody. 5 bullets, 6 steps. The dreamer was down, but the music played on. December 8th, 1980. The night the world's most famous pacifist was killed by violence. Not in war, not in protest, but in a doorway returning home from a recording session. The man who sang about imagining a world without killing was shot in the back by someone who claimed to love him. He was there when the music stopped. And somehow, impossibly, the music never stopped at all. To understand how John Lennon died requires understanding why he died. Not the mechanics, a deranged fan, a revolver, 5 hollow-point bullets, but the deeper why. Why was this man who preached only peace hated enough to be murdered? Why did his message of harmony provoke such discord? The answer lies not in the Dakota doorway, but in a Liverpool bomb shelter 40 years earlier, where a boy learned that the world was violent long before he tried to change it. John Winston Lennon was born October 9, 1940, during the Liverpool Blitz. Nazi bombs were falling on the city, turning buildings to rubble. His first sounds were air raid sirens. His first lullabies were sung in bomb shelters. The world was at war when John entered it, and he would spend his entire life trying to understand why. His father, Alfred, was a merchant seaman who disappeared for months at a time. His mother, Julia, was 17 when she had John, too young, too wild. The family deemed her unfit, and John was raised primarily by his Aunt Mimi, strict, proper, emotionally distant in that British way that mistakes coldness for discipline. John grew up where bombs had left gaps in the streets like missing teeth. Working-class Liverpool kids were expected to know their place: factory work, early marriage, quiet lives. But John Lennon was built for noise. He was clever, mocking, rebellious. He drew obscene cartoons of teachers, formed a gang, got expelled constantly. Aunt Mimi despaired. "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living at it." She was wrong. John would make more than a living. He would make a revolution. And revolutions often end with someone dead in a doorway. Could these early experiences have laid the foundation for both his genius and his destruction? The boy who grew up amid violence and loss would become the man who insisted the world could be different. Who wrote songs demanding we imagine no countries, no possessions, no reasons to kill. Who believed against all evidence that love could be more powerful than hate, but not before Julia died. In 1958, when John was 17, his mother was killed by a drunk driver. The grief nearly shattered him. He would spend the rest of his life trying to process that loss, writing songs about mothers and abandonment and the unbearable weight of being left behind. In 1956, John heard Elvis Presley and formed his first band, the Quarrymen. On July 6, 1957, at a church garden party, he met Paul McCartney. The two recognized something in each other immediately: hunger, talent, ambition. Paul could play guitar properly. John had charisma, edge, presence that couldn't be taught. They began writing songs together. Then George Harrison joined, barely 15 but already brilliant. Later, Ringo Starr on drums. The Beatles, 4 working-class Liverpool boys who decided they would become bigger than Elvis. It was an absurd dream, and somehow, impossibly, it came true, but not before Hamburg. The strip clubs where they played to drunks and prostitutes, the amphetamines they took to stay awake through 8-hour sets, the grinding repetition that taught them their craft through sheer exhaustion. They were boys becoming men in the hardest possible way, learning that music could be both liberation and labor, both transcendence and grind. When they returned to Liverpool, they were different, harder, tighter, more confident. Brian Epstein saw them at the Cavern Club and recognized something extraordinary. Not just talent, but alchemy. The way they moved together, finished each other's sentences, harmonized without thinking. He became their manager, cleaned them up, put them in matching suits, made them presentable for television and middle-class audiences. George Martin, the producer at EMI, heard something in their songs that was both commercial and genuinely new. These were not just covers of American rock and roll. These were original compositions that combined melody, harmony, and lyrical sophistication in ways pop music had not done before. Martin was classically trained, could arrange strings and brass, could help them achieve sounds they heard in their heads but didn't have the technical knowledge to execute. The combination was explosive. In early 1963, Please Please Me hit #1 in the UK. Then From Me to You. Then She Loves You. By the end of 1963, the Beatles were the biggest thing in Britain. But Britain was just the beginning. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? In February 1964, the Beatles appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in America. 73 million people watched, nearly half the U.S. population. It was a cultural earthquake. Suddenly, the Beatles were not just famous, they were the most famous people on the planet. John Lennon, at 23, was suddenly the most famous musician on earth. He had escaped Liverpool, escaped poverty, escaped the bomb-scarred streets and gray futures. But he had also created a prison of a different kind. Fame at that level is not freedom, it is captivity with better accommodations. The touring was relentless. City after city, country after country, hotel rooms that all looked the same, concerts where the screaming was so loud they couldn't hear themselves play. The Beatles would take the stage, play their instruments, sing their songs, but the actual music was drowned out by hysteria. Girls fainted, threw themselves at barricades, wept uncontrollably. It was religious fervor directed at 4 boys from Liverpool who just wanted to make music. John found it increasingly absurd. He would make faces during concerts, knowing no one could see. He would change lyrics, sing nonsense, play wrong notes. It didn't matter. The audience wasn't listening to the music. They were experiencing a shared ecstasy that had little to do with what was actually happening on stage. The Beatles had become symbols, objects of worship, and John, who had always hated authority and artifice, was now trapped inside the biggest artifice of all. The Beatles couldn't walk streets, couldn't go to restaurants, couldn't exist as normal humans. Every movement was tracked by photographers. Every word was analyzed by journalists. Every relationship was scrutinized by fans who felt ownership over their heroes' lives. John's marriage to Cynthia, which had been shotgun and semi-secret, was now public property. His son Julian was photographed by paparazzi. There was no privacy, no escape, no moment when he could simply be John instead of John Lennon of the Beatles. And the pressure to produce was constant. 2 albums a year, multiple singles, films, television appearances, press conferences, photo shoots. The machine required constant feeding, and the Beatles were the fuel. Brian Epstein was their protector, but also their taskmaster, booking them relentlessly, maximizing their earning potential while their fame was at its peak. He knew, they all knew, that this kind of mania couldn't last forever. So they worked while they could, pushed themselves beyond reasonable limits, and tried not to think about what would happen when it all came crashing down. The mid-1960s saw the Beatles evolve into something more dangerous. Artists with opinions. John began experimenting with drugs, with Eastern philosophy, with boundaries. He read voraciously, Freud, William Blake, anything that might explain the absurdity of his existence. He was searching for meaning that success had failed to provide, for something real beneath the performance. LSD changed everything. John's first acid trip was accidental. Someone had spiked his coffee at a dinner party, but the experience was revelatory. He described it as having the walls of perception blown away, seeing reality without the filters of ego and social conditioning. It was terrifying and beautiful and utterly unlike anything he had experienced before. He began taking LSD intentionally, regularly, obsessively. It was not recreation for John. It was research, an attempt to break through the walls of consciousness and find something authentic beneath the layers of fame and image. He would take acid and paint strange, violent, beautiful images. He would take acid and write lyrics that made no literal sense but somehow conveyed emotional truths. He would take acid and stare at walls for hours, convinced he was glimpsing fundamental truths about the nature of reality. But LSD also made him unstable, paranoid, prone to sudden rages and inexplicable terrors. His first wife, Cynthia, would find him in strange states, laughing uncontrollably, weeping, convinced that he had died and was now a ghost, certain that nothing was real and everything was a dream. The other Beatles grew concerned. Paul tried to manage John's unpredictability to keep him functional enough to fulfill their commitments. George understood it better. He, too, was searching for meaning beyond materialism, though his path led more toward meditation and Eastern spirituality than chemical experimentation. Ringo just tried to keep everyone together, playing peacemaker as he always had. The stable one who kept the rhythm even when everything else was chaos. The music they were making reflected this experimentation. Gone were the simple love songs of their early years. Now they were creating sonic landscapes that were psychedelic, complex, challenging. Songs that required studio innovation, that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible with recording equipment. George Martin became more than a producer. He became a collaborator, helping them achieve sounds that existed only in their imaginations. In March 1966, John gave an interview to journalist Maureen Cleave for the London Evening Standard. She had known the Beatles since their early days, and John felt comfortable speaking honestly with her. They talked about many things: his childhood, his reading, his thoughts on religion. Speaking casually about the decline of organized religion in Britain, he made an observation that would change his life. Christianity was fading, he said. The Beatles were currently more popular with young people than Jesus Christ. It was not boasting. It was social commentary, a statement of observable fact about the secularization of British youth culture. In context, it was one small part of a thoughtful, wide-ranging interview about religion and meaning in modern life. In secular Britain, nobody even blinked. The article ran, John gave several more interviews about other topics, and life continued. But when the quote reached America 5 months later, filtered through different cultural contexts, deliberately inflammatory headlines and the hair-trigger sensitivities of Bible Belt Christianity, it exploded. The American South was not secular Britain. Here, religion was not declining but thriving, and suggesting that 4 rock and roll singers were more influential than Jesus Christ was not social observation. It was blasphemy, heresy, an attack on everything sacred. Radio stations banned Beatles music. DJs organized public record burnings, encouraging fans to bring their Beatles albums to be destroyed in bonfires, while preachers delivered sermons about the evils of rock and roll. The Ku Klux Klan issued threats. Death threats arrived by mail, became so numerous that the FBI had to get involved. John, who had only been stating what seemed obviously true to him, was suddenly public enemy number 1 to a significant portion of America. The Beatles' manager Brian Epstein panicked. An American tour was scheduled for August. Millions of dollars were at stake, not to mention the safety of 4 young men traveling through a country where significant numbers of people now hated them. Epstein pressured John to apologize, to clarify, to walk back his comments. The other Beatles, whose careers and safety were now threatened by John's honesty, also urged him to make some kind of statement. John resisted at first. Why should he apologize for telling the truth? He hadn't claimed to be greater than Jesus. He had simply observed that young British people were more interested in the Beatles than in church. But the pressure mounted from all sides. Finally, at a press conference in Chicago at the start of the tour, John offered something that sounded like an apology while actually being nothing of the sort. "I'm sorry I said it," he told the assembled reporters, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt and exhaustion. "I never meant it to be a lousy anti-religious thing. If I had said television is more popular than Jesus, I might have got away with it. I'm not anti-Christ or anti-religion. I'm not saying we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person. I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this." But his eyes told a different story. He was angry. At America, at Christianity's overreaction, at himself for having to apologize for truth-telling. He had learned a dangerous lesson that would echo through the rest of his life. Words have power. Powerful words make you a target, and speaking truth can be more dangerous than any drug. The 1966 American tour was a nightmare. The Beatles played to smaller crowds than before, with protesters outside every venue. John received death threats at every stop. He was terrified, though he hid it behind sarcasm and bravado. In Memphis, a firecracker exploded during their performance and all four Beatles froze, thinking someone had fired a gun. They finished the tour, but something fundamental had broken. On August 29, 1966, the Beatles played their final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. None of them knew it was the end, but in retrospect it was inevitable. They were exhausted, disillusioned, and tired of being symbols instead of musicians. They had conquered the world and found the victory hollow. John, in particular, felt trapped by his own success, imprisoned by fame, desperate for an escape he couldn't quite articulate. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? Those who knew John during Beatlemania's peak describe a man increasingly disconnected from reality, taking LSD regularly, drinking heavily, lashing out at those closest to him because they were the only safe targets. In November 1966, John walked into the Indica Gallery in London for the opening of an avant-garde art exhibition. The artist was a Japanese-American woman named Yoko Ono. She was 7 years older than John, already established in New York's Fluxus art scene, known for conceptual pieces that challenged viewers to reconsider their assumptions about what art could be. One of her pieces that night was called Ceiling Painting. It was deceptively simple: a white canvas mounted on the ceiling, a ladder leading up to it, and a magnifying glass hanging on a chain. Most gallery visitors climbed the ladder, looked through the magnifying glass, and saw a word painted in tiny letters on the canvas. Yes, John was transfixed. Most conceptual art in 1966 was negative, nihilistic, designed to tear down and provoke. But Yoko's work, for all its strangeness, had an underlying optimism. Here was someone who had been through war. She remembered the firebombing of Tokyo as a child, remembered hunger and destruction, and still believed in possibility. Still said yes to life, to art, to connection. They didn't fall in love immediately. John was married to Cynthia. Yoko was married to her second husband. Both were navigating complicated lives and careers, but they recognized something in each other. A refusal to accept limitations, a hunger for meaning beyond commercial success, a willingness to be misunderstood in pursuit of something authentic. They corresponded. John would visit Yoko's art exhibitions. She would send him cryptic instructions for conceptual pieces. Breathe. Listen to the room. Imagine the clouds dripping. He was fascinated by her mind, by the way she thought about art and life, by her complete lack of interest in his fame. She didn't care that he was a Beatle. She cared about ideas, about pushing boundaries, about creating things that had never existed before. Their affair began in earnest in May 1968, while Cynthia was on vacation. The scandal was immediate and vicious. The British press, which had adored the Beatles and treated them as national treasures, turned on John with shocking cruelty. Every racist stereotype about Asian women was deployed. Yoko was a dragon lady, a manipulative geisha, an exotic seductress who had stolen John from his proper British wife. She was blamed for everything, for destroying the Beatles, though they were already fracturing from internal tensions, for leading John astray, though he had always been the one leading, for being foreign, for being older, for being a woman who refused to stand in the background and smile supportively while the men made art. The hatred directed at Yoko was so intense, so pervasive, so unexamined in its racism and misogyny that it became its own cultural force. Beatle wives were supposed to be like Cynthia, quiet, decorative, supportive, essentially invisible. Yoko was opinionated, artistic, confrontational. She wanted to collaborate with John as an equal, not serve as his muse or his applause machine. This was unforgivable to fans who felt they owned John, owned the Beatles, owned the right to dictate what their heroes should do and with whom. But John didn't care about the backlash, or rather he cared deeply but chose Yoko anyway, which was perhaps the most radical thing he ever did. For the first time in his life, someone saw him. Not the Beatle, not the working-class kid made good, not the clever provocateur, but John. Flawed, brilliant, damaged, searching, terrified, angry, loving, complicated John. Yoko offered him something he had never had. Unconditional acceptance not of his image, but of his reality. Together they became more than lovers. They became collaborators, activists, partners in a mission to use their fame for something beyond selling records. Their first joint project was Two Virgins, an experimental album featuring their voices, avant-garde sounds, and controversially, a cover photo of them both completely nude. It was not pornography, but a statement. We have nothing to hide. We are vulnerable. We are human. The album was banned in many stores. Radio stations refused to play it. Critics savaged it. But John and Yoko didn't care. They were making art on their own terms, art that reflected who they actually were rather than who the public wanted them to be. In March 1969, they got married in Gibraltar. For their honeymoon, they staged the first Bed-In for Peace, spending a week in bed at the Amsterdam Hilton, inviting press not for gossip about celebrity marriages, but for serious discussions about peace, about Vietnam, about using celebrity as a platform for change. The press showed up expecting salacious photos of newlyweds in bed, and instead got lectures about nonviolent resistance. John and Yoko, dressed in pajamas, would sit in bed surrounded by flowers and hand-lettered signs reading hair peace and bed peace, and talk for hours about the possibility of ending war through peaceful protest and mass consciousness shift. Critics mocked it viciously. What did two rich celebrities lying in bed know about war? What did their performance art have to do with soldiers dying in Vietnam? Wasn't this just attention-seeking dressed up as activism? But John understood something his critics did not. In a media-saturated world, attention is currency. The Bed-In generated headlines around the world. And in those headlines, instead of reading about celebrity divorces or album sales, people read about peace, about alternatives to war, about the possibility of change. They staged a second Bed-In in Montreal in May, and this time they recorded a song during the event, a simple, repetitive chant about giving peace a chance. It became an anthem of the anti-war movement, sung at protests and rallies, a folk song for a generation trying to end an unjust war. The backlash was fierce and came from multiple directions. Conservative politicians called them communists. Veterans groups called them traitors. Religious leaders condemned their nudity and their advocacy for peace, as if peace were somehow un-Christian. And most ominously, the FBI began building a file on John Lennon that would eventually run to hundreds of pages. They tapped his phones. They tracked his movements. They investigated his associates, his finances, his immigration status. They were looking for anything, drug use, tax violations, visa problems, that could be used to silence or deport him. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI saw John not as a musician but as a threat to American interests, a radical who was using his celebrity to inspire young people to question the government, to oppose the war, to imagine alternatives to the status quo. John knew he was being watched. Friends warned him. His lawyers confirmed it. But he persisted anyway. "Peace is not something you wish for," he wrote to an anti-war activist in 1972. "It's something you fight for and die for." The statement, meant as encouragement, would prove grimly prophetic. John was fighting for peace, and it would cost him everything. In 1970, the Beatles officially dissolved. John had outgrown them. He needed to make music that was more personal, more political, more honest. His first solo album was Raw Therapy, songs about his mother, his childhood, his pain. And then came the song that would define him forever, a piano ballad that asked listeners to envision a world without the things that divide us. The song was deceptively simple, a melody and words that suggested we might be better off without nations, without religions, without possessions. To millions it was beautiful. To others, politicians, religious leaders, those who benefited from division, it was dangerous propaganda. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? The FBI began tracking John in 1971. Under J. Edgar Hoover, they looked for any excuse to deport him from the United States. Why? Because John was supporting anti-war candidates, appearing at protests, using his celebrity to oppose the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration saw him as a threat. John fought back. He hired lawyers, appeared at rallies, refused to be intimidated. "If you want to be a hero, just follow your heart," he said. "But don't expect to survive it." The statement would prove prophetic. The mid-1970s saw John retreat from public life. He and Yoko had a son, Sean, born in 1975, and John made a radical decision. He would become a house husband. While Yoko managed their business, John would cook, clean, raise his child. It was a reversal of traditional gender roles that invited mockery and admiration. For 5 years, John Lennon was largely absent from public life. Rumors circulated. He'd become a recluse, lost his talent, given up music. None of it was true. He was simply trying to be a father, a husband, a human being rather than a symbol. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? John had learned that you cannot change the world through willpower alone. The best you can do is change your own life, treat the people you love with kindness, and create art that might inspire others. But there are people who cannot forgive that evolution. People who saw John's withdrawal from politics as betrayal. People like Mark David Chapman. Chapman was 25 in December 1980. He had been a Beatles fan, then became a born-again Christian who saw John's comment about being more popular than Jesus as unforgivable blasphemy. His life was small and insignificant, and he hated that. In his twisted logic, killing John Lennon would transform him. He bought a gun. He bought a plane ticket to New York. He bought a copy of John and Yoko's new album and waited outside the Dakota building. On December 6th, John signed Chapman's album. "Is this all you want?" John asked kindly. Chapman said yes, but it wasn't. 2 days later, Chapman returned with the gun. The evening of December 8th was ordinary. John and Yoko left their apartment around 5 p.m. to work at the recording studio. At 10:50 p.m. they returned. John was in good spirits, talking about the new album about Christmas with Sean. They exited the limousine. Chapman stepped from shadow to light. "Mr. Lennon?" John turned, recognized the face from 2 days earlier. Before he could speak, Chapman raised the revolver and fired. 5 shots. 4 struck John in the back. He stumbled forward, up the steps into the Dakota's archway, and collapsed in that yellow light. The doorman screamed. Chapman stood calmly, reading a paperback while waiting for police. John was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. Doctors worked desperately. But the damage was catastrophic. At 11:07 p.m., John Lennon was pronounced dead. He was 40 years old, Yoko was told. She asked if there was hope. "I'm sorry," the doctor said quietly. "He's gone." Outside news was spreading. People were gathering at the Dakota at Central Park in Times Square. Someone was playing John's music from a radio. The voice that had sung about peace and love was now silent forever. Silenced by the very violence it had opposed, what hidden secrets might still remain untold behind his public image. John had not been perfect. He had been violent with women in his younger years, had neglected his first son Julian, had said and done things he later regretted. "I'm a violent man trying to learn peace," he had admitted, and it was true, but he had been trying. That was the essential truth about John Lennon. He was always trying to be better, to overcome his worst impulses, to transform anger into art. He never stopped trying, right up until Mark David Chapman decided one nobody with a gun could erase one somebody with a dream. The funeral was private. Yoko requested no public service. Instead, she asked the world to observe 10 minutes of silence on December 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Millions complied. In New York's Central Park, over 100,000 people gathered. The silence was profound, broken only by weeping. When it ended, they sang John's own words about imagining peace. The legacy John Lennon left is complicated and contested. He was a musical genius. That much is undeniable. The Beatles changed popular music forever, transforming it from disposable entertainment into art that could be serious, experimental, meaningful. They proved that pop music could be intelligent without being pretentious, accessible without being simplistic. John was the creative engine driving much of that change, the provocateur who pushed boundaries, who insisted music could say more than conventional love songs. His solo work was uneven but contained moments of startling brilliance and raw honesty. Songs that stripped away all pretense and spoke directly about pain, about loss, about the struggle to become a better person than you were yesterday. Songs that dared to imagine alternatives to the way things were, that asked uncomfortable questions about power and nationalism and religion. Songs that made him beloved by millions and hated by those who preferred their artists silent on matters of politics and peace. But John was also a political symbol, and symbols are dangerous. His advocacy for peace inspired millions but also made him a target for those who profit from war, who depend on nationalism to maintain power, who see any challenge to the status quo as existential threat. His relationship with Yoko challenged gender norms and racial prejudices, inviting backlash from those invested in traditional hierarchies. His willingness to speak honestly about drugs, about religion, about politics made him enemies in the highest places of power. The FBI files on John Lennon, released decades after his death through Freedom of Information Act requests, are staggering in their scope and pettiness. Hundreds of pages documenting his movements, his associations, his political activities, his appearances at rallies and benefits. The government saw him as dangerous not because he had any real political power, he was a musician, not a senator, but because he had something more threatening to established authority. The ability to inspire young people to question that authority, to imagine alternatives, to believe change was possible. The files reveal a government obsessed with neutralizing John's influence. They tried to revoke his visa, to deport him from the United States, to separate him from the anti-war movement he had come to represent. Immigration proceedings dragged on for years, draining his energy and resources, forcing him to spend time in courtrooms instead of recording studios. When legal methods failed to silence him, there were darker suggestions in those files, vague references to other means of dealing with the problem. Language that makes one wonder what might have happened if Mark David Chapman had not acted first. Some conspiracy theorists believe Chapman was programmed or encouraged by intelligence agencies, that John's assassination was government-sanctioned, or at least government-convenient. The evidence for this is thin, mostly circumstantial based on Chapman's strange behavior and mental state. But the fact that such theories persist speaks to something true. John Lennon was seen as enough of a threat to powerful interests that his death served certain purposes. Whether those interests orchestrated it or simply benefited from it may be impossible to prove. But the question lingers, uncomfortable and unresolved. What is certain is that John knew he was a target. He spoke openly about death in his final interviews, joking about it in that dark British way that uses humor to deflect fear. He understood that speaking truth to power came with risks, that his activism made him vulnerable, that choosing love over hate in a world built on violence was dangerous. But he did it anyway, because the alternative, silence, complicity, acceptance, was worse than any danger. Today, the anniversary of John's death is marked annually at Strawberry Fields in Central Park, a teardrop-shaped section dedicated to his memory. The centerpiece is a black and white mosaic with a single word at its center, the title of his most famous song about imagination and peace. On December 8th every year, thousands gather there. They light candles that flicker in the winter wind. They lay flowers, roses, lilies, whatever blooms they can find in December. They play his music on portable speakers, on phones, on guitars brought for impromptu performances. They sing together, strangers united by shared grief and shared hope. The ritual is both mournful and celebratory. People cry for John, for all the music he never got to make, for all the years stolen by violence. But they also smile, remembering the joy his music brought them, the way it made them feel less alone in their confusion and anger and hope. They share stories about where they were when they heard the news, how his music helped them through difficult times, what his message of peace means to them decades later. And they sing, keeping his message alive through their voices, proving that killing the dreamer does not kill the dream. The memorial was funded by Yoko Ono, who has spent the decades since John's death preserving his legacy while also maintaining her own artistic career. She has been both custodian of his memory and victim of continued hatred. Even now, over 40 years later, she is blamed by some Beatles fans for destroying the band, as if four complex human beings had no agency in their own choices, as if everything must be the fault of the foreign woman who dared to love one of them. Yoko has remained dignified in the face of this ongoing hatred. She has used her considerable platform and resources to continue the peace activism she and John started together. She has carefully released his music, curated exhibitions of his art and writings, and ensured that new generations discover the man behind the myth. But she has also insisted on her own identity, refusing to be defined solely as John Lennon's widow, continuing to create challenging, uncomfortable, boundary-pushing art that many still don't understand or appreciate. John Lennon, John and Yoko's son, was 5 years old when his father died. He has only fragments of memory, playing in the Dakota apartment, his father making him breakfast and doing silly voices, laughter, and music always in the background. Mostly he knows John through recordings, through photographs, through other people's stories. He has become a musician himself, carrying forward his father's artistic legacy while trying to escape its enormous shadow, creating his own sound while inevitably being compared to one of the most famous musicians in history. The comparison is both burden and blessing. Sean has his father's musical talent, his mother's avant-garde sensibility, and the weight of a name that opens every door but also creates impossible expectations. He has spoken thoughtfully about growing up without a father, about learning who John was from the world's memories rather than his own, about trying to honor a legacy while also being his own person. Julian Lennon, John's first son from his marriage to Cynthia, has a more complicated and painful relationship with his father's memory. John was largely absent from Julian's childhood, prioritizing the Beatles and then his relationship with Yoko over his responsibilities as a father to his first son. When John did appear, he was often distant, critical, emotionally unavailable, unable or unwilling to provide the support and affection a child needs. Julian has spoken with remarkable honesty about feeling abandoned, about the pain of watching his father become a devoted parent to Sean while remaining emotionally absent to him, about the complicated grief of mourning a father you loved but who never quite loved you back the way you needed. He has forgiven, publicly, repeatedly, but the wound remains. He too became a musician, achieving success in his own right, but always carrying the weight of being John Lennon's forgotten son, the one who didn't fit into the narrative of peace and love that John created with Yoko. Chapman remains in prison, having been denied parole 12 times. He has expressed remorse, claimed religious redemption, but he also admitted his motive. He wanted to be famous, to be somebody. He achieved that goal. He is the man who killed John Lennon. It is the only thing he will ever be known for. Paul McCartney said after the death, "I didn't lose a friend. I lost half my soul." George Harrison spoke of John with affection and exasperation, missing most his honesty. Ringo Starr remains direct. "It broke my heart. It still breaks my heart." Yoko Ono has spent decades preserving John's legacy while maintaining her own artistic career. She has been both custodian of his memory and victim of continued hatred. Sean Lennon was 5 when his father died. He has vague memories but knows John mostly through recordings. Julian Lennon has a more complicated relationship. John was largely absent from his childhood. The question that haunts everyone who studies John's life is whether his death could have been prevented. Should he have had better security? Perhaps. But John had resisted such measures. "If I have to live in fear," he told a friend shortly before his death, "if I have to surround myself with bodyguards, then they've already won. I might as well be dead." Some argue John was reckless. Others insist he was brave. Both perspectives have merit. John was simultaneously naive and courageous, idealistic and foolish, a dreamer who refused to let reality crush his dreams. The night stays cold over Manhattan. The Dakota building stands solid, enduring. The yellow light still burns at the entrance, pooling on the same stones where John fell. The blood has long washed away, but something remains, not visible but felt. A presence, a memory, an echo, but the music never really stopped. Somewhere right now, someone is hearing John's most famous piano ballad for the first time. Someone else is discovering the Beatles. A child is hearing a song about love and feeling something shift. John Lennon died over 40 years ago, but the dream he articulated, imperfectly, naively, hopefully, refuses to die. It persists in every protest for peace, every call for justice, every moment when someone chooses connection over isolation, imagination over resignation. John knew the world was violent and cruel, but knowing the world was broken did not excuse us from trying to fix it. "Reality leaves a lot to the imagination," John said once, and in that paradox lies his entire philosophy. Reality is what it is, brutal, unjust, violent, but we can imagine it differently. And in imagining it differently, we take the first step toward making it different. That is why John Lennon matters 40 years after his death. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't. Not because he had all the answers, he didn't. But because he asked the right questions and had the courage to pursue them even when it cost him everything. What if we didn't need countries to divide us? What if we didn't need religions to separate us? What if we just needed each other? These are radical questions. They remain radical. And they are questions worth pursuing, even if the world is not yet ready to hear them. Could John's death have been prevented? Yes, better security might have saved his life that night. But John had wanted to be free, to walk his neighborhood, to be normal. To live in constant fear would have been just another prison. He wanted freedom, and that desire made him vulnerable. But it also made him human. The night John died, someone stood outside Roosevelt Hospital playing his music on a small radio. The melody drifted through the cold December air, mixing with sirens and crying. And somehow, in that moment, the music was louder than the gunshots. The dream was stronger than the bullet, the imagination more powerful than reality. That is John Lennon's legacy. Not the awards or the sales figures, but the simple, radical insistence that we can imagine better, that we should imagine better. That imagining better is not weakness or naivety, but the most courageous act available to us. Even if, especially if the world kills us for it, the yellow light still burns at the Dakota entrance. The sidewalk has been walked over by millions since that December night. But the memory persists, not just of death, but of life, of music, of insistent belief that we owe it to ourselves and each other to imagine something better. Somewhere a child hums a melody about imagining peace, and the dream continues its quiet rebellion. The dreamer died in a doorway 40 years ago, but dreams are harder to kill than dreamers. They persist, they evolve, they find new hosts, new voices, new ways of spreading. John knew this. He understood that reality leaves a lot to the imagination, that the world is what it is, but we can imagine it differently. And in imagining it differently, even for a moment, even in a song, even at the cost of everything, we prove that change is possible, that peace is possible, that love, despite all evidence to the contrary, might actually be enough. The yellow light still burns, the music plays on, and somewhere, always, someone is imagining. Was John Lennon killed for being famous, or for daring to imagine a world without violence? And if peace costs a life, do we call it martyrdom, or just proof that the world wasn't ready?